Hello again. This is podcast 2 of a series of 6 that looks at the Nazi policies towards Germany's Jews from 1933 when Hitler became Chancellor up to the outbreak of World War II in 1939. This podcast will focus in on this strand here. The national community. Podcast 1 looked at Nazi views, so that's an area that we've covered, and now we'll look at the national community, or volksgemeinschaft as it is called. So let's move on. Okay, so a bit of general revision really. These are points that, so a lot of these points we have covered in previous revision sessions, so you can't really separate out policies towards the Jews from the other topics. So let's focus in on that word national community, or volksgemeinschaft. Okay, so you can see the word. There, volksgemeinschaft. If you can learn the correct spelling of German words, and that's again something you just got to practice, write it down. It definitely is a path to a good mark, to a high mark, as long as you're using the term correctly. So what does national community mean? Okay, well, we have seen that in the years when Hitler was campaigning for power in the 1920s, before he became Germany's leader, one of Hitler's central views was that the Weimar Republic, when Germany was a democracy, was weak. And the reason that Germany was weak during the 1920s was Hitler believed democracy, by giving German people political freedoms to form their own parties, what that did is it weakened Germany because it divided Germany. Okay, so it pitted Germans against Germans. Which, in a sense, is what is a strength of democracy. What we see as a strength, but Hitler saw it as a weakness. So German people did not identify with Germany; they identified with a political party that supported their particular social group. So, for example, German working classes were either communists or social democrats. The German middle classes were German nationalists, for example, or they were the German Catholics identified with the Catholic Centre Party. And in the Reichstag, of course, the different parties disagreed with each other, and it was very difficult to form a united Germany, a strong government. Okay, and so that was one of the weaknesses of Germany in the 1920s from Hitler's point of view. So Hitler, it was part of his world view, as we call it. His view of the world was that democracy was divisive, and that when he came to power, he always claimed he would get rid of democracy, create a strong authoritarian government, as we call it, with strong authority from the top, a dictatorship basically, in which different political parties would be abolished. There would only be one party, the Nazi Party, and of course when Hitler came to power in 1933, that became law. The law for the creation of a one-party state was passed in the summer of 1933, and of course the Enabling Act abolished democracy. It basically meant that lawmaking now lay entirely in the hands of Hitler. The Reichstag had no part, the Parliament, in the passing of laws. So the idea of a united national community was central. Now, the united national community that Hitler defined excluded racial types who were not considered to be German. Okay, so as we saw in the previous podcast, Hitler had a very, very distinctive definition of what German was. To be German, you had to be racially pure. Now, that's very different from the way in which we traditionally define nationality. Okay, so the traditional form of nationality, before Hitler came up to power, you were a German if you carried the German passport. Jews carried the German passport, therefore they were German. You were German because you spoke the German language. The Jews spoke the German language, therefore they were German. shared culture, identity, traditions, etc. There's lots of ways of defining nationality, but Hitler's definition of nationality was none of those. Hitler's definition of nationality was based on biology. It was based on the blood type of the Germans. And so therefore, Germans who did not carry the correct strain of blood, such as the Jews in Hitler's view, were not members of the national community. Now, this did not include just Jews, it included other lower races. In the previous session we looked at the hierarchy, and we spoke about the other subhumans. Okay, so the Untermenschen, the subhumans or Untermenschen. So, for example, black Germans were not members of the national community. You may remember we talked about the undesirables. Okay, these were Germans who, through their behaviours, were seen to be putting themselves before their country. So, for example, alcoholics, tramps, prostitutes, people who were greedy, were also classified as outside the national community. They were not proper Germans, because a good German should be prepared to put their life on the line to strengthen their country. So a very, very distinctive view about race. Okay, so the long-term goal was to create a master race through basically breeding. And what that basically meant was introducing policies in which Germans would be encouraged to select an appropriate racial mate, somebody to have children with, and so therefore the children, the qualities of the mother and father through their blood could be carried through to their children. So effectively, they are breeding pure Aryans. They're breeding a master race, and therefore they are weeding out unhealthy Aryans. Okay, so selecting a spouse. We looked at a document called 10 Commandments for the selection of a spouse, and of course the very cream, the elite, the highest form of Aryan were the members of the SS, who had to prove Aryan ancestry going back 200 years. So the subhumans, okay, the Untermenschen, again that's a word, if you can learn the German word, use that in your answer, were the people who were a burden on the national community, the Untermenschen, subhumans. Racial inferiors such as Jews, but also included undesirables, as we just mentioned. And undesirables, tramps, alcoholics, prostitutes, etc., but also increasingly people with illnesses, mental or physical, who became a burden on the national community, were seen as undesirables. So the Nazis increasingly, for example, they introduced what we call hereditary courts. There was a health law introduced in 1933 which forcibly sterilised Germans who carried illnesses, hereditary illnesses. Okay, so they were not allowed to have children. Okay, and it reached its peak, this sort of attitude, at the beginning of World War II, when the Nazis introduced by law euthanasia. Okay, euthanasia, I'm sure you've covered that in RE lessons, which is the forcible, taking of the life of people who were seen to be a burden on the state. Now, because the Nazi reason for introducing euthanasia was as a burden, it was not about mercy killing at all. It was simply they are a burden. They do not have the right to life because they are taking good Germans' attention away from making the country stronger. The program of euthanasia was called the T4 program, and it was introduced at the start of World War II in 1939. And for that particular program, the Nazis developed gassing. They developed gassing facilities, It's one of the few examples Hitler actually cancelled the programme because there was popular protest in Germany against it, but the technology of gassing was then of course used and sent out to Poland and was used against the Jews in the Holocaust, that we'll do at a later stage. Okay, so there is the few key questions. Again, remember to learn those key facts, that is important. Learn it off by heart, do flashcards, etc., etc. And the answers to those questions are on the next slide, so if you just pause and then press play and you'll see the answers. And those are the answers. Okay, hopefully that was useful to you. The next podcast will move into Jewish policy itself then in the early years, 1933 to 34. Thank you.